Alright, I'm gonna start speaking. If you guys can let me know whether you can hear me, that would be super helpful. Just say yes if you can hear me. Cool, great. Sounds like a lot of people can hear me, that's great. We've got 20 people on at the moment, so I'm gonna wait 5 or so minutes. Thank you all for being early, well, on time. Sorry for being not on time myself. Well, I'm kind of on time, but I said that I was going to give you the link 15 minutes before. Not IT problems this time. I got off work quite late compared to what I was expecting. Becca, yes. So if you go into the folder that I sent you last week, all of the guides should be in there. So if you go back into the same link, sorry if I didn't make that clear, but every time you're looking for a guide, it would be in there. How is everybody? It's Wednesday. Whenever it's Wednesday, it always makes me like think of this joke that I heard from a long time ago, but it stuck with me. So, you know, one of those like old fashioned calendars that has like the whole month on it, that you used to be able to buy from like Paper Chase or something, that's like printed on paper. So if you think about how like it says Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, but sometimes it gets shortened to just MTW, right? And if you think of the first letter of each word, it's M for Monday, T for Tuesday, W, T, F. And this joke just went, in the middle of the week, even the week itself goes WTF. Yeah, the way that I delivered that was extremely poor. This is probably why I'm a Strive consultant rather than a comedian, but I guess I chose the right career path. I guess I'm also like a trainee lawyer too, that, by the way. Right, 3 minutes past, we're on 31. Where is everybody? So yeah, in case you guys didn't manage to have a look at the PDF, now would be a good time. Or if you want to go to the loo, or if you want to go and get some water, I'm going to get started in a minute or two. That's on. Yes. Actually, yes. I actually remember you saying that you were interviewing at a firm which shall not be named. And the interviewer asked you to tell him a joke. What is that? That's actually hilarious. Strange. Yeah, but just so you know, everybody, um, someone from this chat who has just spoken, he or she, which I will not tell you, interviewed at a firm last year and got asked by the partner, I think it was a partner, pretty sure it was a partner, to tell him a joke. And, At Strive, we like to think that we prepare you pretty well, but even like that, we didn't. I could not have thought in a million years that that was going to be the question. If I was asked that, I don't know what I'd say. I'm a pretty unfunny person fundamentally, so I'm just going to be like, I don't know. If I was funny, I wouldn't probably be a lawyer. Luke Pierce is Jodie Coughlin, I think. So yeah, I'm gonna be starting pretty soon. People are still rolling in. They really should be on time. But does everybody have their PDFs in front of them? Because this one's we're gonna need it this time. Well, we're gonna need it every time, but it's particularly helpful this time. And just in case you guys are not aware, if you remember that last time I sent you guys an email with 3 guides in it, after the application drafting workshop, if you go back into that one, you should be able to download all 3 guides and you should be able to follow. So one of the guides is a technical guide teaching you how to upload stuff onto Google Drive so that you can share it with us. For those of you who are not familiar with Google Drive, for those of you who are familiar, it's going to be super easy. If you guys have applications that you have not sent us, just send them in whenever you're ready, and follow those instructions. There are a couple of you who've still been sending me emails. I understand because last year that was the process, but this year we've changed it, so make sure that you follow that guideline. Gareth, pro bono, 2 separate words, so pro space bono. Okay, cool. We're on 42. Let's make a start. Good evening, everybody. It's me again. So sorry that last time we couldn't make it on Saturday. Both me and Sana were not really particularly well. Cool. Shamim. Well, this is the beauty of Strive. You can kind of do it from anywhere. Anyway, so enough chit chat. Let us start. All right. Commercial awareness, the big word. Everybody talks about it. Everybody is obsessed about it. Everybody panics about it, but no one really knows what it means. So, to start off with, can you guys kind of pop into the live chat what you think commercial awareness means to you? Hader, or sorry, completely butchered your name probably. Where can we find the guide on sending apps? If you go back to the email that I sent last Wednesday, you should be able to see an email with 3 PDF attachments. Download all 3, read through all 3. So, yep, Stephanie says, knowing what goes on in the world, how changes in the legal sector might affect a business. Yep, that's good. Hey, Connie. Knowing the problems that businesses face and how law firms can help them. Yes, that's all true. Now, actually, yeah, how to add value to your clients. Yeah, so you guys have kind of hit the nail on the head. But I just kind of the responses that have come in are quite interesting because they're kind of split into different categories. So some of you have said like knowing about what happens in the world, so that's more about knowledge, awareness. A couple of you have mentioned kind of having the business acumen, being able to say to a partner during an interview or say to a client when you're advising them, how is a certain thing going to affect your business? How is that going to affect our legal advice? So that's all correct, but I just want to bring out something, which is that a lot of people think that commercial awareness is about the knowledge. So that's the first thing that I just talked about. It's about knowing what happens in the world, and it's about reading the FT cover to cover. It's about reading The Economist, and it's about being able to kind of regurgitate information. That's not even half of it. I think that's probably the most dare I say, entry level of it. A lot of people stop there, and that's how not to get a training contract. The second thing that I mentioned was kind of being able to integrate the business acumen into it. So, Ghazal, for example, you said news that affects a client's business and how you can therefore advise them. Yes, so shaping your advice, shaping your opinion around the client's needs. So, if you were talking about Brexit, for example, just knowing about Brexit is not going to be enough. You're going to have to shape your advice regarding Brexit to each client's specific needs, to their specific interests, to their specific motivations, etc. I'm going to go a lot more in depth into how we're going to do that. I'm going to give you a few frameworks to do that. But before we kind of delve into that, I want to tell you how I define commercial awareness, and I define it with three things. The first one is client-focused business acumen, which is what I just said. Secondly, understanding law firms as businesses. I think someone mentioned it in the live chat. Don't remember who, sorry. But yeah, that's a good point. And the third one, last but not least, is actually the knowledge part of it, keeping up with current affairs. So as you can see, the reason why I put keeping up with current affairs last, not because it's not important, but because it's the thing that everybody knows. Everybody's going to think that commercial awareness is about the knowledge, about how much you can show off. Like, oh, look, I can talk 5 minutes about Brexit. Okay, great, but can you analyse it? That's what we're talking about today. So, the first part of the definition, which is client-focused business acumen. Now, I have a super simple, probably silly case study for you, but just to hit home the point of why this is so important. So, let's say you've got a client coming to you, they are a co-founder of a startup and she's super passionate about it, but they're very short-staffed because, at the end of the day, they're a startup. They don't have a lot of funds, and she is running this whole show pretty much on her own. With her co-founder, let's say. Brightsparks is an educational platform, so it's for children, and she used to be a teacher, so she's extremely passionate about this project, but she has a million things going off on her mind. She is a programmer, however, so she is a CTO, which means Chief Technical Officer, in case anybody's unclear, and her background is in computer science. She knows how to code, she knows how to write programs, but she knows not the first thing about law. And she doesn't care either. Don't know why that man's there. Right, so what she is coming to you for is that she is going to have a meeting in a week's time, and she is going to be discussing the pros and the cons of launching an IPO. For those of you who are unclear, IPO stands for Initial Public Offering. It means a private company, a private company, meaning the shares in that company is completely owned by completely owned by people in the private sphere, I guess you can say. So in other words, if a private company is trying to sell shares to the public, so like to you or to me or to your grandma, that would be illegal. So she's trying to go from that kind of a company into a public company, which means that she has the entitlement, and it would not be legal if she goes on to, for example, the London Stock Exchange, puts her shares on there, and invites people to buy them. So invites people like you and me and your grandma to buy them. That's called an IPO. And legally, it's quite complicated. There are a lot of loopholes to go through. One of the biggest issues with an IPO, for example, and I'm probably going into a little bit too much depth here. There should be a separate session on kind of these jargony things, but just for current purposes, part of the reason why Alyssa's coming to you is because she's particularly worried about the legal impact. What kind of information does she have to give to potential shareholders? As some of you may know, if you're trying to launch an IPO, it's kind of one of the major drawbacks of an IPO is that you have to give a lot of information, a lot of financial information, a lot of strategic information, a lot of personal information about your directors, for example, into the public sphere, and that's a legal requirement. So Alyssa's coming to you and she's saying, I've got a meeting next week with my board of directors, and I basically need to go to them and tell them the pros and the cons, legally speaking, of an IPO. Now, the reason why I'm and she's come to Strive & Sons, who is you, very, very famous law firm, and she's come to you so that you can give her a short, sweet, kind of, maybe not a one-liner, but just a short email so that she can read it very quickly and she would be able to talk to her board of directors. So she does not give a crap about law. She doesn't care about law. All she knows is coding, and all she has is her company. She doesn't care about anything else. This case study is just to really hit home the fact that you need to step into your client's shoes. You need to understand where they're coming from. Your clients are not paying for you as a lawyer to show off your knowledge. They're not paying for you to regurgitate what was on the FT. They're paying for you to look at what's on the FT and then fit it to what they want, fit it to what they are, fit it to what they are aiming to be. You see? So hopefully that has made things a little bit clearer in terms of the perspective you're coming from. You're always coming from the client's perspective, and in an interview, you're always thinking from the firm's perspective, which I will later come on to, but also the client's perspective. Integrating those together, if you're, let's say, interviewing at Linklaters, if you're thinking from the client's perspective, it would be really, really helpful if you know who Linklaters clients tend to be, their size, their industry, their needs, their wants, the trends in those industry. So taking all of those things together, commercial awareness is much, much, much more than just reading the FT. Yes? Cool. So next point, understanding law firms as businesses. So now that we've talked about the clients, it's also really interesting to note what that specific piece of news is going to mean for law firms. So let's take a really generic example, Brexit. Let's say Slaughter and July, they're an international law firm, absolutely no relation to Slaughter and May. I wouldn't know why you would think that. One of their clients is a car manufacturer that has a supply chain across the whole of Europe. So the 2 points that I'm making are different to the extent that if we're talking about the client perspective, you're going to be talking about very different considerations than if you're talking about the law firm's perspective, even if you're talking on both perspectives about Brexit. So applying the Brexit thing to the client, to the car manufacturer, you would be saying, well, would you start thinking about kind of relocating your factories? Would you start thinking about the tax issues that are involved in that? Would you start thinking about selling your real estate or selling your stakeholding in whatever companies are within Europe? Something like that, or within the UK. And if you're talking about Brexit when it comes to law firms, you're thinking about law firms as a money-making machine. Law firms make money by advising clients, right? So you're thinking from the perspective of Slaughter and July, you're thinking, what kind of sectors do they operate mostly in? So I've already mentioned car manufacturing, but maybe they operate in other sectors such as more domestic sectors like, local supermarkets or local like transportation, like one of their biggest clients might be TfL, for example. So those clients have a little bit less of an exposure, arguably, to Brexit. You see how kind of those perspectives are quite different. So anyway, going into the law firm's point then, this is super interesting and super, super important. A lot of law firms are going to expect you to understand how they operate as a business. A lot of people, I'm sure none of you think this, but a lot of people think of law firms as legal, they're about law, but they completely forget about the fact that they are, at the end of the day, just like Tesco's, just like, H&M, just like Mango, COS, I don't know why I'm naming all these clothing brands. Just like any of them, they are a business, they are out there to make money. Never forget that. And as a trainee, as someone who is aspiring towards being a trainee, you need to be acutely aware of your place in this business, your place in helping your company make more money, right? As crude as that sounds. Cool. So the three things that I'm breaking this down into is what challenges do law firms face, how do they retain their competitive advantage, and the third one is more of a kind of knowledge information based session on what the different practices of a law firm do, just because there's a lot of jargon in that area. So just in case you guys are not familiar with those terms, I'm going to be clearing those up. Anyway, you guys might start to recognize some of these questions, so not going to name any firms here, but a lot of firms do ask questions on, what do you think the biggest challenge in the legal industry currently is? What do you think is going to happen in the next 5 or 10 years? What do you think is the biggest threat? What do you think is the biggest opportunity? So if your dream firm is asking these questions, then listen up. Right, first part, what challenges do law firms face? Actually, I'm going to come back from that and ask you guys to tell me what you think the biggest challenges are. Yep, Stephanie, tech disruption. We're going to be going into a lot more detail about tech. Yep, Ayodele, clients want greater quality of work for less. The Big Four. Yep, exactly. Cool, great. So you guys seem to, well, I could probably just hop off this call now. You guys are pretty good at this. Yeah, so you guys have named the ones that I basically was going to talk about in a little bit more detail. So I've split this into kind of three main challenges. There are of course more, but I just wanted to talk a bit more about these ones. The first one is clients expecting more for less. So back in the day, not that I personally remember these days, but people around me, so partners and senior associates, they tend to remember it, the older generation. And they remember a time when clients didn't really care how much lawyers were charging them. They were always going to have a budget for it because they know that the lawyers are important, and however much the lawyers charge, they're going to be like, yeah, fine, that's what the lawyer wants, we're going to give them that. But increasingly, and I think since the financial crisis, if not before, clients are expecting to pay less, but also to have better services. Now, money doesn't grow on trees, and money doesn't come from nowhere. You can't have cost savings without doing something about it. You can't just say, oh, that piece of work used to be worth 10 hours of partner time, now it's just going to magically become 3 hours. There are ways that law firms do that, and as you guys have pointed to or alluded to, technology is one of them, but we're going to go into a lot more detail for that later on. So, clients expecting more for less. I want you guys to go and have a look at task 1 on the PDF. Just quickly skim through it, and I will tell you next steps. So if you guys can start telling me what you think about the methods that you think law firms employ when responding to changing consumer behavior. Yep, so Hader says many firms making use of technology to carry out the simple tasks so they can focus on the complex work to save costs. Yep, AI. So technology is a clear factor, and we're going to again go into more depth regarding that. I think was it Ayodele? No. Aminata said, clients wanting the same quality service for less, so firms having to charge fixed rates. Now, a really important point, a really interesting point that I've gathered when I started my training contract, for those of you who are not familiar, I started my training contract about 2 months ago, and I've been doing some billing stuff, which is actually quite uncommon for a trainee, but it's interesting because I'm actually handling how much money the firm is charging for a certain piece of work, and sometimes it's kind of almost a bit sad, and you kind of feel a bit sorry for the lawyers because they get villainized for charging extortionate rates. But when you actually think about it, like, the charge out rate sounds horrific. Like, even a trainee lawyer is going to be worth 200, 300 pounds. But if you think about the fact that almost half of all of that money, so if you bill, let's say, 8 hours per day, only around 40 to 45% of that, only 50 to 55% of that really gets charged. So 40 to 45%, 40 to 45% of that kind of gets written off. And by written off, I mean you've actually done the work, but the client doesn't want to pay it, so you're going to just have to strike it off and pretend it never happened. So law firms are probably earning less than you would expect. Yeah, and Ayodele, you've also mentioned another point, fixed fees. So that's another thing that I have realized in billing as well. A lot of lawyers tend to say, "Oh, we're gonna charge you £1,000 or £2,000 for this project," and even if you end up spending £3,000 worth of lawyers' time, you're gonna be capped at 1,000 or 2,000 or whatever you agreed with a client. So fixed rates is something that is going to make you more competitive. And for those of you who've done economics, you will realize that the more competition there is, the better quality services or goods you tend to see in the market, and also the lower the price tends to be. This is what's happening in law firms. Law firms are constantly trying to undercut each other with cooler tech or better hourly rates or better fixed rates, and clients are having much more of a say in where they can go. If a firm is charging them a little bit too much, then they can always just go to another firm who is only too happy to serve them. Cool. So that's the first one, clients are becoming pickier. The second thing is attack from non-traditional players. So a lot of you have mentioned, hi Bisma, that's fine. A lot of you have mentioned the Big Four and kind of other accountancies or other traditionally non-legal organizations kind of jumping on the bandwagon. Now, the important point when it comes to writing your applications to remember is that it's important not to overplay this factor too much. So I'd say the client's expecting more for less factor. You can't really overplay it. Clients really, really are doing that massively. But when it comes to attack from non-legal players, yeah, it's happening, but it doesn't really tend to affect the firms that you guys would be applying to, or most of you guys would be applying to. So if you're talking about Magic Circle, Silver Circle, city law firms, they are not really affected by this. It's mostly maybe the regionals, but mostly the high street law firms, because for the people who are able to handle non-traditional, so the non-legal people or non-legal organizations that are able to handle legal work, they tend to be quite commoditizable, quite basic, quite low-level work. Hence why the Tesco law effect. It's kind of like cheap and cheerful. You know, it works, but it's not the best service you can get. You wouldn't go to Tesco's for a kind of tuxedo. You'd go maybe for a cheap sandwich, but you wouldn't go for really complicated things, right? Now, the reason why I've said Legal Services Act 2007 there is because there's a really interesting change in 2007 in that act that meant that this is a new factor for law firms, especially regionals and high street firms, to be taking into account. So the LSA, before the LSA happened, it used to be only companies and firms that are registered with the SRA, so the Solicitors Regulatory Authority, that would be allowed to practice law. If you were, let's say, Deloitte, who is one of the Big Four, who is traditionally an accountancy, you wouldn't be allowed to give out any legal advice. If you did, that would be illegal. But after the LSA, traditionally not, so firms or companies that are not registered with the SRA, they could be given a license which allows them to give out legal advice or certain kinds of legal advice. And they are obviously charging less because they are kind of doing the more low-level stuff. And so clients tend to start compartmentalizing their work. I think it was Ayodele who mentioned in-house as well. So this kind of also factors in a way, in terms of the fragmentation of the legal profession, which is what I'm going to come on to. But the essential point is that clients are much happier to divvy up their work and give it to the people who would charge less for it. So, for example, if I was a client and I had three categories of work within the same project. Let's say I was doing a really, really complex M&A deal. For the really mundane due diligence stuff, I might just give to, I don't know, some really cheap law firm. For the paperwork that's super, super, super easy to do, and I just need someone to sign off on it, for example, I might go to the Big Four. And for the complex stuff, for example, the tax stuff that I really cannot get wrong, I might go to Ashurst. So clients are a lot smarter with knowing which parts of their work to give to who. Secondly, legal tech startups. So again, it is important for you guys to remember not to overplay this. A lot of people say in the applications like, oh my god, like legal tech, you know, it's going to rock the world of law and it's going to make us all lose our jobs. I mean, no one really says that, but it's just that some people do tend to overemphasize what legal tech can do and can do, but they don't think about what they cannot do. It's important, if you have time, to go and have a look at the legal tech landscape at the moment. I think what might shock you guys is that it's nowhere near as sophisticated as you all think it is. So, for example, I'm a trainee at the moment, I can honestly say that there's a lot of stuff that I do that's very administrative. And I'm shocked that there is not technology, there's not software that already automated it. But that's the state of the legal industry. There's a lot of stuff that's still in the process, even if we do have software. For example, we do have a lot of really helpful software, to be fair. I don't know whether you guys have heard about Kira, for example. Yeah, Connie, I did say the Tesco law effect. That's actually on the screen as well. The Tesco law effect is just kind of non-traditional players offering cheap and cheerful legal services that don't really require much expertise. But anyway, yes, so going back to legal tech startups, don't overplay how cool it is, how sophisticated it is. Kira is a due diligence software that a lot of firms use, but even then, like, there's a lot of... So for those of you who are unfamiliar, if you're, for example, doing an M&A deal, if I was the buyer and the other side was the target or the seller, in order for me to make sure that I know what I'm buying, so if I think that company looks great, but I'm not sure whether it actually is great, and I don't want any nasty surprises, I need to do my due diligence, which means I need to go into their data room and look through all of their documents to make sure that there's nothing that's going to surprise me once I buy them. Now, traditionally, back in the olden days, not that, again, I remember, but there are massive, like, warehouses that trainees and paralegals have to kind of spend overtime on going through manually to check for clauses in contracts that's on, like, the page 232 of 1326, which is an impossible task, and it used to be extremely costly. But Kira comes along, digitizes everything, and flags everything that it thinks may be a problem, which is super handy. But the point here is that even Kira, which is a super widely used software, we all know its limitations, which is that at the end of the day, it's still not very reliable, it still misses some points out, it still flags points that it shouldn't be flagging, and at the end of the day, the way that it is for legal tech is that you still need a human being at the end to verify that information. So the point to take away here is don't get too excited. It's still not nearly as helpful or as good at even the simple things, so like admin things, going through boring contracts. It's not even good at that yet. So just think about how long it's going to take before it starts getting good at actually advising clients with actual substantive law. That being said, over in the States, they're making much better progress than we are over here. For example, they are, I think IBM created a robot a couple of years ago where the robot's actually like within a law firm, and they're actually like giving out advice to the lawyers, not to the clients directly, but to the lawyers, kind of telling them what to research and what kind of helpful pointers. But that's kind of it for now. Even in the States, you don't see robot lawyers advising clients. You only really see robots advising the lawyers who then advise the clients. So it's important to remember that, at least for the time being, clients still value that human touch. Cool. So the third thing, fragmentation of the legal profession. This is super interesting. So a lot of firms will have. So okay, let's go through this list point by point. It goes both ways. Law firms outsource work from other providers offshore, and second point, law firms contract out their own employees, part of the gig economy. So, point one means that law firms, let's say if we're again doing a super massive M&A deal, it would be really stupid to get a partner to review all of the documentation and do the due diligence. That would be astronomically expensive. So, I mean, the old way of doing it would be to delegate that to the trainees, the poor trainees, and the poor paralegals. But even that's not enough now. Clients are asking for, again, expecting more for less, so they're asking for even more cost savings. What that means then is that you're correct, having to ask technology to do it, but if we're having to ask human beings to do it because the technology is not good enough, there are two ways law firms tend to do that. First of all, they could set up a business center. So Ashurst has that. Lots of other firms have that as well. They would, for example, build an office that's in Ashurst's case, that would be Glasgow, somewhere that's not London, basically. So somewhere where rent is cheap, labor is cheaper, living costs are cheaper, so that you can cut the overheads. Overheads meaning your kind of normal, usual expenses. And yeah, so let's say we're again doing that M&A deal. For the cheaper parts of the work, you would send an email to your colleague in Glasgow and say, hey, can you help review this? And they can come back to you, so you can spend your own time sitting in London doing other stuff that's kind of a little bit less commoditizable, meaning it actually requires you to use your brain and you actually need legal expertise to do it. That's the first thing, location. Building an office in a location that's going to cost you less money. The second thing is coming up with titles, coming up with job positions that require less monetary investment. So in the case of Ashurst, sorry I'm like focusing a lot on Ashurst, but I mean I'm at Ashurst, so it makes sense. We've got legal analysts. So legal analysts are people, I believe, who are not necessarily legally trained or don't have a law degree, don't have like the qualifications that you and I would have. For example, I have a law degree, I have an LPC, the firm had to pay me to do the LPC, the firm is investing in me to do a training contract, whereas with the legal executives or the legal analysts, they're there to do sort of the more mundane things. They're there to maybe put together agreements when terms have already been agreed, so there's not much thinking behind it. It's just about typing the terms physically and manually into the contract. Whereas a trainee would be thinking more about drafting and, whether this clause works. So stuff that's actually a little bit more discretionary. So that's the second thing. Delegating tasks to people who have less qualifications but are still able to do a large chunk of the kind of more heavy lifting. So that's the first point, how law firms outsource to offshore. But in terms of other providers, an interesting trend as well is that law firms, sometimes they can't even be asked, they can't be bothered to set up a different office themselves. So what they do is they actually go and hire somebody else. So for example, I'm not saying that Ashurst does have this agreement, but I'm just saying, for example, Ashurst might choose to not set up an office in Glasgow, but instead give all of their work when it comes to due diligence to, well, actually that's super risky. Let's not talk about due diligence. Let's talk about kind of engrossing or typing in edits or kind of putting in comments or putting in words into a contract. So really boring stuff that, someone who's not legally trained can do. they might hire somebody or some firm or some company that is very cheap, that's maybe in India or maybe in other parts of the world, so that they can send them over to a third party. So this is not Ashurst at all. They have a contractual agreement between them. That's about it. And they send the agreements over to there to be processed and comes back to Ashurst, for example. Again, not saying Ashurst does have this, but this is an arrangement that some law firms may choose to have. The benefit of this, along with law firms actually setting up their own office in another part of the world, is time zone difference. So it kind of makes everything a little bit more efficient. If you're talking to somebody who is in India, when you go to sleep, they get up and they do your work for you, so that when you come back into the office in the morning, they have your work ready for you and you're ready to go. So that's another sort of added bonus. Along with the fact, of course, that places like India, labour is cheaper, rent is cheaper, everything's cheaper. So basically, the effect of that is that the London offices tend to be a little bit smaller now. They tend to be only housing lawyers who really need to be seeing clients. For the non-client facing people, so a lot of HR, for example, a lot of the business services, they tend to be based up in Glasgow or wherever the firm might choose to have an office or business centre. Right. Second point, law firms contract out their own employees. This is really interesting. This is actually something that I believe, don't quote me on this, I believe A&O started. So a lot of lawyers, especially women, but also men, and I think that this trend is only going to increase because we're all millennials and we all love working from home and we all love flexibility, etc., etc. Because we can't suck it up and we can't just do five days a week anymore because we're all useless. No, I'm just kidding. But law firms are increasingly seeing that their employees are very insistent on having flexible working options. So a lot of them might want to work from home, but a lot of them might go beyond that. A lot of them don't even want to be full-time employed with a firm, but the firm still wants to make money off of them. What do? The firm, or some firms, now have the option of hiring their previous employees who are very good lawyers but don't want to work full-time as consultants. So freelance lawyers who still, if they do work, they will still earn money for the firm, but they're not there on a full-time contracted employment basis. And this kind of goes a little bit back to the point I was talking about, how clients are a lot more about unbundling, and that's a jargony cool word that you can use, unbundling. So if I have a massive project, clients are now a lot smarter about shipping off different parts of the world of the work, cutting it up and shipping it off to different people to make it the most cost efficient possible for them. This kind of goes back to that point, because a lot of these lawyers are able to take on really, really, really difficult stuff. So they are people who may be only working on this deal for 8 hours or 10 hours or 20 hours, so that the client knows exactly how much they're going to have to pay for them. And these consultants only really give opinions on sort of the most complex stuff, but their help will not be needed when it comes to the more mundane parts of it. And the benefit of this is that if you think about a traditional model, the traditional way that a client works with a law firm is the law firm pitches, the client goes, I like that, let's work, let's give our piece of work to you, and then the law firm kind of sees the matter from beginning to end. They follow through everything. They provide all of their departments, so whether they need finance, they need tax, they need real estate, the whole firm is kind of like all hands on deck all the way through, and the client needs to pay them, well, they don't need to pay them every month, but the point is that the cost is very, very high, because all the way through, even if you technically don't really need that lawyer, you're just still kind of paying for them. Whereas when it comes to consultants, you're much more able to say, I only want your opinion on this one very specific question. After that, I don't want to see you anymore. And that's part of what's called the gig economy. If you think about Uber, for example, that's a classic example of the gig economy, because you're it's almost like dump and go. Like, once you finish with something, that's a really crude way of saying it, but it's like, I need this service now, I'm going to have it now, but after I'm done with you, I'm just going to go. There's no continuity, there's no sort of relationship there. Everything's relatively disposable, but everything's super efficient. That's what we mean when it comes to fragmentation and gig economy. Cool. So that's that. How do law firms retain their competitive advantage? For those of you who have a slightly more analytical / mathematical mind, revenue, now the formula for revenue is extremely simple. Revenue means kind of the amount of money a business makes. And the way to calculate revenue is very simple. Profit, which is the money kind of that comes in, minus your costs, which is the money that goes out. What you're left, technically, there's a lot of other complications like tax and etc. But minus all that, what's left is your revenue. So law firms are obviously concerned, like I said at the beginning, they're businesses, so they're, much like every other business, concerned with maximizing their revenue. As I said, the formula has two parts. There's maximizing profit and there's minimizing costs. So if you want to maximize your revenues, you got to do it in two ways. You got to maximize your profit and you got to minimize your costs. So I want you guys to now turn to task 2. And basically just write down everything that's on the slide right now. I'll talk through them in a minute. So, while you guys are doing that, expansion strategies, merge or die. Well, it's not quite as dramatic as that. But I think that a lot of law firms are now really having to think about their expansion strategies. There used to be a time when a lot of law firms are like, oh, we're going to build an office there and we're going to do it there and we're going to make our firm massive and it's going to be great. Law firms are a lot more cautious about doing that now. And when it comes to expansion, and you guys are very, very much free, and I've noticed that you guys have gone quiet, hopefully not bored, but hopefully listening to me. But feel free to kind of put in the live chat comments or thoughts. Expansion strategies. Law firms are having to be a lot more cautious with where they expand, obviously, because if they open an office and then suddenly realise that it's not profitable, they have to shut it and it's just all a bit of a faff, and obviously building a new office costs a lot of money, so you don't want to be doing that. One of the biggest factors that determines where a firm is going to be opening a new office is follow the client. If you are starting to get a lot of work from a particular part of the world, and a lot of law firms will start off by partnering with what some firms call a best friend law firm. So let's say I was Ashurst again, and I do not have an office in, I don't know, Finland, for example. If a Finnish client wanted me to do a bit of work on Finnish law, rather than building an office in Finland, which is going to cost me a lot of money, I'm just going to set up a relationship with a very good Finnish law firm so that they can do my work for me. I will obviously be paying them, but that's kind of how law firms ensure that without having to spend the money on a truly global network of offices, they still get the benefit of being global by partnering with local law firms. But when it gets to a tipping point where the firm realizes that there's so much business in that area, you're partnering with these law firms so much that it's actually worth you thinking about starting a new firm, That's what I mean by following the client. There are a couple of you who are particularly interested in the African region, and you're right. The that region is really interesting for a lot of law firms at the moment because there's a lot of, for example, telecommunications, a lot of kind of startup new ventures that would really require legal assistance, which is why a lot of law firms are either setting up new offices there or they are really partnering with the local law firms there. But yeah, that's expansion strategies. The other thing I want to talk about as well is merging. So yeah, I think it was Naomi. Yeah, KKW. Of what can happen if you get too big and fail to adapt. Yeah, it's interesting to see how some firms think that they're so big and so powerful, but then big and powerful can mean failure if you're spending too much money on kind of maintaining that image without a lot of income coming in. So no, you're absolutely right. The other thing that I wanted to talk about in expansion is merging. So you guys might have, for those of you who have been following the legal industry for a while, you might have realized that a lot of firms are merging. So it's pretty rare to see a city firm that has not gone through a merger. So you can probably say any name and they probably would have gone through a merger. So Ashurst definitely has. Clifford Chance definitely has. BCLP, they used to be BLP, and they've kind of merged, added a new name in there. CMS, probably one of the biggest mergers in the legal industry to date. Yeah, any law firm you can name, and that is more out of now. There is actually a exception. Well, there are a couple of exceptions, but most remarkably, sorry, Slaughter and May. They have a pretty unique strategy, and it seems to have worked. That they're keeping pretty local, but they do have a really extensive network of sort of international best friends, like I mentioned. It seems to work well for them, but a lot of other law firms like to be more international and they like to be bigger. I think as well that Slaughter and May has such a unique culture that they're quite protective of it and they don't necessarily want to expand and have to merge different firm cultures, which is understandable. But most other firms don't take that view. Most other firms merge, and I think out of survival instinct. If you've got like a massive firm, you're likely going to be generating more income, you're likely going to be having more market presence. If firm A merges with firm B, firm A gets to acquire the clients that firm B used to have. If firm B is your competitor, for example, which is not unlikely at all when it comes to the legal industry, which is a pretty small industry, there aren't that many players. If you acquire your competitor, that's one less competitor that you have to fight against. So a lot of the merging stuff is very survivalist, and it's about if everybody around you is merging, it's a matter of time before that other firm across the road is going to be snapped up. It's either going to be your competitor that snaps them up, or it's going to be you. Would you rather snap it up before your competitor snaps it up? Well, probably, because otherwise your competitor is going to snatch them up and you're going to die. And some smaller firms have died that way. So this is one way of maximizing profit. Nurturing repeat client relationships. This is extremely important to law firms. Like I said earlier on, AI has a place, software technology has a place, but ultimately, at least to this day, law is very much about human touch. It's about, oh, I know Fred, who is that lawyer. I've known him for 20 years. I trust him. He's done great work for me, so I'm going to keep going back to him, even though I know that technically Mary, who is somebody I don't actually know, she can probably do it for cheaper, but I know Fred and I trust him, right? So this is why firms do a lot of cool events, seemingly for nothing. seemingly they host talks that don't give them any revenue. Seemingly they do a lot of pro bono stuff, or they do a lot of this and that, which doesn't seem to make a lot of business sense at first glance. But when you actually look at who's going to these events, and if they're doing pro bono work, whether it's because a client has requested that they do more corporate social responsibility or CSR projects, those things to attract clients in a softer way. So the ways that I've been talking about is cutting your costs and upping your tech, right? Those are very hardcore ways of doing it, and there are softer ways of doing it at the same time. Lateral hiring. For those of you who are unfamiliar, so if I was a trainee at ABC ABC LLP, who is a firm, and I progress through the ranks, and I'm an associate, and then I'm a senior associate, and then I'm a junior partner, I'm a partner, senior partner, whatever, all the way through that ladder, that's fine, that's good, but the firm would have put in a lot of money to train me from the very beginning. Me, for example, I'm a trainee, and honestly, I'm not making the firm any money. The firm is probably losing money on me because they're having to train me up from scratch. I don't know anything. So training is actually quite costly. Trainees are very costly. If you hire laterally, for example, you can hire an associate, but even more lucratively, you can hire partners, which means that you're hiring from across the road, that competitor firm that has a really good partner who's going to bring 10 clients along with him. That's a dream. You want his clients, and you want his expertise. You don't want your competitor to have him. What better way than to poach him? And because he probably trained at another firm, you don't need to spend the money on training him. He comes into your firm and he kind of hits the ground running and starts making you money, rather than having to have you invest in him first, like a trainee would. So that's maximizing profit. Minimizing costs. We already said nearshoring for commoditized work support centers. Tech solutions, again, we'll go into a little bit more detail. And the fall of billable hours and rise of fixed fees. We touched on this already, but to go into a little bit more detail. Back in the day, lawyers charged by the hour, and to a certain extent, lawyers still charge by the hour. Every lawyer probably has about 8 hours a day, and law firms kind of bill per hour. This lawyer is going to be worth £400 an hour, whatever. But if you're going to be minimizing costs, to a certain extent, if you give a fixed fee, the lawyers then are a little bit more motivated to work a bit harder. So if I knew that I was going to be charging out by the hour, why do I care? I'm going to, rather than spending 3 hours on a task, I'm probably going to spend 3.5 to 4 hours, because I'm going to be a little bit more chill about it. But if I know that this is going to be a fixed fee, I want to get it done as soon as possible, because I want to move on to some other task that I'm going to be earning more money on, right? So that's sort of one way of minimizing costs, if you think about it. Cool. What do the different practices of a firm do? This is where I kind of explain a bit of the jargon, actually. Questions. If firms want to expand, why do some choose mergers instead of Swiss vareins? That's really interesting, actually, Katie. I think the most prominent example of a Swiss varein is probably CMS, I would say. I would say the Swiss varein is actually quite a unique model, and it's not for everybody, because if you think about CMS, for example, a lot of their Swiss vareinness comes from their branding. So for those of you who are not familiar with what a Swiss varein structure is, and I have to say that I'm not by any means an expert on it, but from my understanding, a Swiss verein is where you're it's kind of like a system, like a network. So if you think about CMS, for those of you who are familiar with CMS, it's like a network of CMS firms, but they're not the same firm. So let's say Ashurst, for example, we have offices across the globe, and there is sort of like a shared pool of money. So the money that Ashurst Sydney makes is the money that Ashurst Hong Kong makes, is the money that Ashurst London makes. The whole firm is one, whereas a Swiss verein is more sort of compartmentalized. So the CMS UK is technically a different firm to CMS France, is technically a different firm to CMS Germany, etc., etc. And so the costs and the profits made by France would not be shared by UK, would not be shared by Germany, would not be shared by any number of other countries. So that's quite an interesting model. And I think that it doesn't work for most firms because to a certain extent, it doesn't really promote collaboration. So think about it. If I was in CMS London and my CMS France colleague comes to me, rings me up being like, "Hi Tilly, can you help me with this piece of work?" Well, no, because even if I help you, that money's not going to come back to my firm anyway. Why would I be helping you? Like, you go and find your French colleague and, you can help yourself. You see, so the Swiss verein is always a bit of a tricky one. Although you might then ask why CMS is doing it. Honestly, I can't say that I know very much about CMS, but my understanding would be that it's kind of more about the branding, and it's a little bit more flexible. So they are able to retain their own culture within each of their offices, quote unquote. It's not really an office; it's more a different firm. They're more able to utilize the network in terms of their branding. So they're able to say, "I am from CMS," but then have deeper roots within each country. But in terms of Katie's question, if firms want to expand, why do some choose mergers instead of Swiss vereins? I think most firms actually do choose mergers rather than Swiss vereins. Another thing as well is that with mergers, international mergers, it's kind of, for example, if I was a UK firm that's acquiring a firm that is in India, and I already know that they're the strongest firm in India and they've already got their client base, they've already got very, very sophisticated runnings, I'd want to acquire them because I don't need to build anything, I don't need to invest anything to kind of get it up and running. So if I was a law firm, I think it would generally make more sense to do a merger rather than a Swiss verein. Cool. So, practice areas. I apologise to all of you who think that this is boring in terms of the practice areas, because some of you might already know this knowledge, but hopefully some of you don't, and this is going to be helpful. So I'm using Clifford Chance's template because they do have quite a clear split and quite a logical split, according to me, I think, of different practice areas. Now, before we actually jump in, a lot of you tend to confuse practice areas with sectors. Now, that's quite an important differentiation. If we're talking about sectors, we're talking about agriculture or groceries or like property market. Like, they're kind of like different industries. So different markets, right? But if you're talking about a practice area, we're talking about specific technical expertise of a lawyer. So, for example, a corporate lawyer or a tax lawyer or a litigation lawyer, right? Now, if I was talking about a specific sector, let's say I was talking about agriculture or I was talking about, I don't know, education. Let's say I was a school, right? I come to the law firm. I'm in the education sector, but I come to the firm and ask for lawyers from different practice areas, right? As an education sector client, I come to the firm and ask for a tax lawyer and a real estate lawyer and a finance lawyer to be on my deal. Does that kind of make sense? Hopefully it does. And if it doesn't, just let me know. But right, practice areas. The different practice areas are antitrust. So you don't have to remember this, and different firms split it different ways, but this is a good starting point. This Clifford Chance's way of splitting it up makes sense to me anyway. Antitrust, which is, by the way, just another name for competition. We'll go into a bit more as to what that means. Capital markets, corporate, finance, litigation, / dispute resolution, real estate, and tax, pensions, employment incentives. Right, firstly, going into antitrust. Antitrust is the American term for competition, and what it means is, let's say company A and company B are merging, or company A is acquiring company B. Let's say if company A was Tesco's and company B was Sainsbury's, we have a problem. If you're merging Tesco's and Sainsbury's, that would be a humongous company. They would basically monopolize the entire market, and that would be, in a capitalist society, that would be a big no-no, because you're not giving consumers any choice. This massive giant can probably dictate the prices, and the consumers are just going to have to accept. So that's not good. And so the competition authorities are going to come in and say, no, you cannot do this deal at all. Or they're going to come in and say, yes, you can do this deal, but on the condition that you get rid of a couple of arms to make sure that you're not as big as you would otherwise be. That's competition. Capital markets. Capital markets and finance kind of come together in a way, to my mind anyway. Capital market. Let's talk about finance first, actually. Finance, for those of you who interviewed with me, you will know that finance is about kind of finding the money. If you're a company and you wanted to do anything, be it building a new factory, be it buying a new company, be it paying off a loan, you're going to need money. And the finance department is going to help you draft the agreement. They're going to help you maybe go and find the banks that are going to give you the money, that kind of thing. Whereas capital markets, it's more about, well, what it says on the tin, the markets. Capital markets are also about money. They're also about finding money, but it's kind of sourced from a bigger pool. So if you're a company and you're trying to find £1 million for whatever reason, finance may be more going to a bank and asking for that bank, or asking for a couple of banks to together give you a million. Whereas if you go into the capital markets, you might be going to, 10,000 different people, 10,000 different shareholders, 10,000 different bondholders to altogether give you that 1 million. So that's kind of like the difference. Cool. Corporate is pretty general. It could be anything, but most sexily, it's M&A. And that would mean, for example, well, mergers, acquisitions, obviously, but it would also mean that the practical task of what they're going to be doing is basically due diligence, writing up the agreements, making sure that basically the project management of the whole deal. So they're probably going to be at the eye of the storm. They're going to be coordinating different departments, stuff like that. Anything that's corporate related as well. So, for example, if you're going to be doing something that is related to the accession of some trustee or some director of a certain company. You might be, so basically anything that's to do with corporate procedure, you would probably want to do to advise a corporate lawyer. Litigation, dispute resolution. Dispute resolution is a very broad term, so it's when two parties kind of disagree, obviously. But litigation is a very narrow thing. So litigation is only one method of dispute resolution. For those of you who've done ADR, alternative dispute resolution, at law school or in your LPC, you will know that there are other ways of resolving disputes. So, for example, mediation, which is not technically legally binding, arbitration, which is kind of legally binding. I'm not going to go into the mechanics or the specifics of it. Expert determination, the list goes on. But litigation is kind of generally more costly, generally more time consuming, generally much more procedurally dominant. And so a lot of clients, specifically commercial clients, they may tend to gravitate towards the sort of other ways of resolving disputes. Real estate, pretty self-explanatory. So we're talking about buying, selling properties, leasing properties, or the lot. That all sounds really easy, but actually there's a lot of kind of subsections in it. For example, I'm in construction, so construction would also belong to real estate, but construction kind of doesn't really do leasehold, that kind of stuff. But not a lot of firms really have a construction department. Tax, pensions, employment, incentives. It's interesting that they put them all together. I would personally put tax in a slightly different category, because tax is about, tax advises on everything. So tax is relevant in a real estate transaction because you might need to pay stamp duty, land tax. It would be relevant in an M&A deal because you may have to pay stamp duty, or you may have to pay CGT, capital gains tax, or whatever. Everything has to do with tax. Pensions and employment and incentives, that's where sort of, if let's say we were talking about an M&A deal, and let's say you really want to retain the director who is on the board of the target company, you might think about how you're going to make your incentives or your employment package a bit more attractive for him so that he's going to stay on in your new company's board, that kind of thing. And just as a super general comment as well, a lot of people like to use the words transactional or advisory or whatever to describe their seat or describe their department. And just in case you guys are not sure about what those terms mean, they're quite fancy terms, but there are generally broadly three different categories. So there's transactional, there is advisory, and there's contentious. So transactional means that, you're doing transactions. So the general rule of thumb is that if you know how to do one transaction, you kind of use the same idea and you kind of replicate it across every single deal, and you kind of push through a deal and you push it through another deal, and that's kind of your whole life. You do deals. And they all kind of look broadly the same. Whereas if you're talking about advisory, so that's more sort of, let me backtrack. Transactional, you can think of as, for example, real estate. So you're day in, day out, you're selling interest in land, you're buying interest in land, you're creating leaseholds, you're selling leaseholds, and it's kind of all quite formulaic and you kind of follow the same process. Another good example of a transactional seat would be finance. So finance deals broadly all look the same. You go to the bank to ask for money, you create that document, and then you sign it, and then you do security documents, etc., etc. So it's quite formulaic, whereas advisory is a bit different. A classic example would be tax, for example. So tax advises other departments. So tax normally tends to have their own work as well, but the bulk of their work tends to be advising different departments around the firm. So if finance wanted to push through a transaction and they had a tax issue, they would go to the tax lawyers who would advise them. Same with real estate, same with, I don't know, corporate, whatever. The third thing is contentious, which is pretty self-explanatory. It's just the sort of dispute resolution part of the firm, to be honest. So, cool. That is practice areas. Sectors, not going to go into a whole lot of detail because it is pretty easy. There's banks, everyone knows what banks are. Consumer goods, retail, so that would be your high street firm, so your high street H&M, your high street like BHS, which is now unfortunately closed. Energy resources, so that would include anything to do with oil and gas, to green fuel, that kind of stuff. Funds, investment management. For those of you who are not familiar with funds, funds is the idea of having money in a pot and then growing it. So for those of you who I have interviewed, I may have introduced you to the idea that you putting £1 million in the bank is not really that great of an idea, because inflation means that your £1 million in the bank in 2019 is going to be valued less at 2020, is going to be valued less in 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, right? So it's not smart to be sitting on your money, but it's smart to put your money in a fund so that you can grow your money, not only to fight against inflation, but hopefully to way surpass it and to grow your money. Healthcare, life sciences, chemicals, so that would be a lot of IP, so intellectual property. So I would be thinking about drugs, I would be thinking about pharmaceuticals, I'd be thinking about patents, I'd be thinking about inventions, and basically quite a technical area of law, super interesting, I personally think. Industrials, actually I have no idea what that means. So for those of you who are acquainted with CC, you can probably tell me. Insurance, pretty self-explanatory. Private equity. Private equity is probably the most important one for you to take away from here. I'm sure a lot of you know what private equity means, but some of you don't. So let's go through this. The whole concept of private equity is essentially, if I was a private equity house, I would look at a company and I would buy them for whatever reason, and I'll go into that in a minute. I'd buy them and then use my own management skills, because I'm a private equity house, I'm going to be very good at managing companies, I'm going to be very good at growing companies. So remember, revenue equals profit minus costs. So I'd be very good at maximizing profits and lowering costs, so that in 3 years or in 5 years or probably max 7 years, I would have grown that company to such a point that I'm going to sell it and I'm going to make a nice fat check out of it, because it's going to have grown so much under my expert command that by the time I sell it, I'm going to be making a massive profit. Private equity houses tend to have a portfolio of probably the same companies that are within the same industry. So for example, if I was a private equity house that specialized in energy and renewables, I would be buying companies that specialize in energy and renewables. And that makes sense, because you would probably have a very, very different management style in energy and renewables than you might do in transport and logistics, right? So private equity houses tend to have one specific area of expertise, or one or two or three, but most private equity houses tend to have those areas of expertise rather than kind of scattergun approaching and just buying any old company. Another interesting thing about private equity houses is that they don't have to, but a lot of them tend to rescue companies. By rescue, and I'm putting that in quotation marks, I mean looking at a company, seeing and acknowledging that it is screaming for help, and it cannot go on any longer because their management is going down the drain and they're managing the company terribly. So the reason I'm going to do that is because I'm going to be able to buy that company for cheap. And then once I turn it around, I sell it for a lot of money. Right? So that's the idea of private equity. Real estate, again, pretty self-explanatory. I guess real estate is also a practice area in its own as well. Telecommunications, media, technology. So we're talking about BBC, we're talking about Sky, we're talking about phone companies, that kind of thing. Transport and logistics, again, pretty self-explanatory. We're talking about TfL, we're talking about, Stagecoach, that kind of thing. Cool. And so kind of tying everything together, it is possible to be a antitrust lawyer that specializes in insurance, or it is possible to be a real estate lawyer that specializes, actually no, that doesn't make sense. It's possible to be a finance lawyer that specializes in telecommunications. So for example, I would be a lawyer who is particularly good at finding money from banks or other debt institutions on behalf of people or companies that are within the telecommunications industry. So it's kind of like a mix and match. But the point to take away here is, if you haven't heard anything that I've just said, is that practice areas are very different to sectors, and don't mix them up. Cool. So that's that. Keeping up with current affairs. So if you guys remember this screen, there are 3 parts to commercial awareness. The third part is keeping up with current affairs, which is what everybody thinks when they think about commercial awareness. How are you going to really read about the news? Now, there are lots of news outlets, as you all know, but you will all, again, also know that the FT is not for everybody. The FT is a great publication, I love it, but not everyone's going to understand it, and not everyone's going to find it interesting. And if you don't know the jargon, which, by the way, if you haven't already read the book, go and buy the book, totally worth it, called Know the City by Chris Stokes. If you read that book and hopefully buy it, when you go through the FT and come across any terms that you don't understand, that book is going to hopefully really help you, because it explains kind of jargony terms in simple ways. Right, this is just a Venn diagram of the different publications that I've found quite helpful personally when it comes to doing a training contract application. But I'm sure a lot of you will have different ideas and different suggestions. That being said, the important thing to take away from this diagram is not just the names of these publications, but also the idea that they are for different purposes. So the blue circle is for a very general overview. So if you wake up in the morning and you kind of want to get a very brief overview of what's happening in the world, you go to BBC, you go to Guardian, but you don't really go there for kind of in-depth analysis. The red one is kind of where once you've nailed down a topic, so for example, if you went to BBC and you found an article that really interested you, or a topic that really interested you, and you want to start really thinking about analysing what's happening, the trends that's happening within that news article, the nuances, the different stakeholders, what they want, and the different people, the different actors who were involved within that news story, what do they all think and what do they all want? Then you go to the FT, then you go to The Economist. The Economist is more The Economist is more sort of trends, but in a more nuanced way. It's more about the gist of the economy, whereas the Financial Times is much more, you can pin a lot more down with the Financial Times. You get a lot more sort of I'm not saying The Economist is not concrete, but the FT is much more much more commercial almost in their analysis. The Economist is more sort of gist and more sort of the general global economy, which is also interesting and also very important for a training contract application. But if you're talking about extremely commercial stuff, then the FT is the right place. Cool. That's that. Another important point, how do I make sure I'll actually read the news? A lot of you is going to listen to that and you're just going to go, yeah, the FT, whatever. And then you're going to end up not actually doing it. And I used to be exactly the same, so I don't blame you. These are a couple of quotes that we got from future and current trainees as to how they actually made sure that they read the news / make sure they read the news. I need to really get back into the habit of reading the news again. Finimize is great. There is a mobile app which can actually get a little bit annoying in a great way because it nudges you and it gives you notifications when there's some interesting news. Finimize is amazing. They're free and they kind of explain everything in really simple terms, which is great. Some really cool person who I have a lot of respect for has decided to set the FT as their homepage, which, that's a bit crazy to me. Twitter, if you're a Twitter phobe, Twitter has really, really good news, even though, sometimes they're not the most reliable, they're not the most nuanced, but for a quick overview of what's happening in the world, Twitter is my go-to. Google Alerts are also quite good. You can set Google Alerts for basically any topic. For example, when I was applying to Ashurst and I was applying to a couple of other firms, I typed in the name of the firm in Google Alerts and made Google alert me every time there was something happening about that specific firm. So the same principle applies to if I was particularly interested in oil and gas, or I was particularly interested in like fintech or something. Reading the news on the commute into work, university, regular download for news podcasts. There are some extremely good podcasts on BBC. I think it's BBC4. Go and have a look on the app called BBC Sounds. They have some really, really good analysis of kind of what's happening in the world, and a lot of really cool speakers and a lot of really unique insights. Don't worry about the names if you haven't caught them. I will be sending out a mass Slack message with the names of all of these shows and all of these different materials so that you guys kind of get everything in one place. Yeah, Ilma, the book is really, really good. Definitely worth buying it. I know that you're all students and it's not a great idea to ask you to spend money, but no, that book is seriously worth it. I think it's going to be super helpful for your TC applications. Cool. Next point. How do I make sure I'll remember what I read? A lot of you will read the FT and you will try to make the effort, and I salute you for that, but you might not remember. Again, we've got quotes from some trainees with top tips on how to make sure that you actually remember. So you need to make sure that it's interactive. So you need to be having conversations with your friends. Oh yes, Ilma, Wake Up to Money. That's a great one. That was actually going to be the one that I was going to send in the Slack message. So thank you for reminding me. Yeah. Going back to how to remember what you read, I remember that with the friends that I had who were also applying for training contracts, it was really helpful and actually almost kind of fun to be discussing with them. Kind of pick out a couple of issues that you're both interested in and just have a chat about it. It's much easier, as this trainee has said, to remember discussions, to remember the points that your friend made rather than the points that some scholar or other on The Economist, some page or some issue or another that made. You don't really care about that person, and it's much easier to remember what you say to your mate rather than what you read as well. Another top tip, same paragraph, and this is something that I found extremely helpful myself. As you all might know by now, I am a massive fan of Google Docs. And I remember creating a Google Doc it kind of ran for about 3 to 4 months. And it's important that it runs for such a long period. But this Google Doc was basically whenever I saw something on the FT or whenever I saw something on Finimize that I think might come up in a TC interview, or I might want to discuss in my TC interviews, I type it into my Google Doc and kind of share it with my friends so my friends can also contribute to it. And if you have made friends within the Slack group in the Strive community, honestly, you guys go do your own thing. You guys can set up your own Google Doc. 3 or 4 people can set one up and just kind of set up maybe bi-weekly chats for half an hour, 15 minutes to chat through that Google Doc. I think that's going to be super helpful. Yeah, and I remember that the night before my training contract interview, I was ferociously going through that Google Doc, just kind of, it's almost like revising for an exam and kind of cramming everything that all the notes that I've written in the past 3 or 4 months, so that I can kind of, not regurgitate, but remember what I spoke to my friends about. The second tip then, focus on macro trends, not micro. So especially when you're reading the FT, maybe not so much BBC News because they're quite good with overviews, but with the FT assumes quite a lot of knowledge, assumes familiarity with a certain industry. If you read the FT and you're not familiar with the jargon, you're not familiar with the industry, it's very easy for you to fall into a pit of, oh my god, there are so many facts and everything's confusing me, and oh my god, I can't do this. It's important to step back, and if you don't understand something within the FT, maybe it's good to go back to BBC. Maybe it's good to go back to The Guardian and kind of see the bigger picture before you delve back into the micro. Because chances are, if you're talking about something in a training contract interview, you're not going to have enough time to mention specific statistics. And if you mention specific statistics, that's great, but you don't have to. It's much more important and much more interesting for a partner to hear your thoughts on a trend in an industry rather than some obscure statistic that has happened sometime. That's just not that interesting, and it's not worth the anxiety of kind of trying to cram every statistic you see on the FT. Better to understand the bigger picture, criticize it, or agree with it, whatever. Tip 3, don't feel pressure to know everything that's going on. There's always going to be more to know. And I think one of the most overwhelming things with commercial awareness is that people come to me and they say, oh my god, there's so much to know. The FT is like miles thick. Where do I even start? The best tip to remember here is that there's always more to know. Cut it down. Find things that are genuinely interesting for you. If you're not interested in driverless cars, then don't talk about driverless cars. Talk about renewables if that's what you're into. Find 2 or 3 topics, hopefully 3 topics that you're going to be following through until you get your training contract. So 3 months, 4 months, 8 months, whatever. Be an expert in that field. And find very different topics as well. Don't find all 3 in tech, for example. Find maybe 1 in tech, 1 in energy, and 1 in tax or something. And set up your Google alerts for that topic, for the big players in that topic, and have your opinion. That's the biggest thing. Going back to my very kind of, at the very start I said, it's not about the knowledge, it's about the analysis. Really try to form your own educated opinion about it, because chances are, if you go into a training contract interview, they're not really going to pick on you, and they're not going to say, Tilly, please can you tell me about this really specific industry that no one's heard about, and tell me about this very specific company that has collapsed. They're probably not going to do that unless you voluntarily volunteer that information, in which case, don't do that because that's silly. If you don't already know something really well, then don't really bring it up in a TC interview because you're just inviting questions. But yeah, important to have your own opinion and your own analysis. On that point, I am now going to give you the most important part, and I'm sorry for saying this at the very, very end of this session, but this is going to be by far the most important thing you take away from this workshop, if not the whole of the Strive program. Before we start then, sorry, a couple of questions. Becca said, what did you talk about in your interview? The topics I chose, I don't actually remember. I think I chose 3. I don't remember the third one. The first one was something about, I think it was driverless cars or something to do with like robots and ethics, something like that, which was quite controversial. Now actually that brings me to a good point. Don't do something that's super generic. So don't talk about like, oh, you know, AI is going to take over the world and it's going to automate everything and, you know, blah, 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 because everybody's going to say the same thing. I think I said something about like the ethics of driverless cars and then talked about, you know, whether that, if a driverless car killed somebody, is that murder? And there's like interesting legal developments happening there as well. The second one is the high street. So back in the day when I was doing my training contract interview, and I think still to this day the trend continues that high street stores, if they're not really revamping their strategy, they close down. So that was my second thing. You can see how they're quite different. The third thing I don't remember, but definitely don't talk about something that's super generic like Brexit, because Brexit is not really a news article. It's more of a thing that permeates everything. So if you talk about Brexit, it's kind of like talking about tech. Well, okay, what's tech? And can you be a bit more specific? Yeah. Ollie, Tilly, where would you put City AM as a news source? That's a good question. I think it's good in terms of, it's kind of like the BBC in my mind. I mean, the BBC is much more reputable to me, but City AM, if you've got nothing else that you can read on the train, it's good to grab a copy and just have a good view of what's happening in the world, but I wouldn't use it as your basis of analysis. I would use it as a tool to pick your favorite topics and your favorite companies to watch and your favorite people to watch, whatever. But if you're going to be drilling deep into a topic, I really definitely don't recommend that you stop there. Okay, cool. Case study news article. I'm going to skip over the legal tech stuff because that's kind of probably not as important. But let's go into the case study, which is going to teach you the single most important thing that you need to take away from this workshop. Right. This should be in your PDF guides. If you guys go into Appendix 1, you will see Data Protection Watchdog finds Bupa for data breach, Financial Times, 28th of September 2018. If you just have a super quick skim of that, and then we'll try to apply the frameworks, which I will bring you through in a minute, to this article. Alrighty, so pretty straightforward article. Data leak as a well, not leak, data breach. Committed by, interestingly, Bupa's own employee internally, so there's no hacker, no one's stealing information externally. And Bupa has been fined £175,000 under the Data Protection Act rather than the GDPR, which is another interesting thing. Becca, yours is blank. Are you sure? Go to the very bottom of the PDF document. You should be able to find it. Yeah, so let us go and have a look at the framework. You'll be able to find the framework on page 4, I believe, of your handouts. That page is probably the single most important page of this whole handout, and probably maybe in your whole Strive workshops. The first part of that page is exactly the same as what I'm showing on the screen right now, which is what, so what, now what. That's the first framework. The what is the sort of facts, so what's happened. So I've just gone over what's happened in this article. Bupa has been fined £175,000 for an internal data breach, and it was under the Data Protection Act 1998 rather than the GDPR. That's the what. A lot of you, or a lot of people, will stop at the what. If a partner asks them at a TC interview, so tell me about a piece of news article that has grabbed your attention, they'll say, Bupa's been fined, it was an internal data breach, the end. That's not going to score you any points, because the partner probably could have just gone on Google and found that out. And applying the principle that I said last time, if you can Google it, what you're saying is probably not very valuable. So you need to really progress beyond that, right? It's kind of like if you, for those of you who do essay subjects or specifically law, some of you will know that if you try to write in an essay, this is the law, full stop, you're going to probably fail your law degree. You're not applying anything, you're not analysing anything, you're not drawing any conclusions. And the same principle applies here. If you're going to just stop at this is what happened, full stop, the end, you're not going to get anywhere. So what? After giving the facts, you need to then analyze the background. Why did this happen? What can we draw from this in terms of the bigger trends? Is this signaling something that's part of a bigger trend? So for example, if you were analysing a news article that was about a law firm's merger, you might then be able to say, well, this is actually quite interesting because it is part of a bigger trend by lots of different law firms to merge because of their survivalist instinct. If they don't merge, then there's a great possibility that the competitors are going to merge with the potential target, and then they would die out because they become too small in a very competitive market. Or, you know, if you're talking about another industry, I don't know which one, but you would say, well, this merger and acquisition is actually super interesting because it's the first that has been done in this industry for a long while, and it's interesting to see that this is the person, or this is the organization, or this is the company that's decided to do it, because traditionally this company has been very conservative, but since they changed their board of directors, it seems that they've been a lot more adventurous lately, and they're much more willing to take riskier pioneering actions, whatever. So just kind of drawing a bigger picture conclusion from the what part of this diagram. The third part of this diagram is now what. So as a commercial lawyer, a lot of you will already know that it's not about the law, it's not about what you can say, but it's about what you can tell the client to do. So what should each stakeholder do about this situation? If you're a lawyer, obviously the advice that you're going to be giving to your client is going to vary greatly depending on who your client is. Going back to this Bupa example, if you were advising Bupa, your advice would be very different to if you were advising Bupa's competitor, right? And that's something that we're going to get into just in a minute. As you can see, the rectangle is bracketed around the second and the third arrow, so the so what and the now what. This is where you need to be applying the stakeholder analysis. So, what is the stakeholder analysis? That's where the second part of your PDF handouts, the second part of that page comes in, that wheel of different people. So, what does stakeholder mean? Simply, it just means a person or an organization that has an interest in the situation for whatever reason. So, if you were the lawyer advising any one of these people, you'd probably have slightly different things to say to each person. So, let's kind of go around the wheel and see what we get, right? So, the green part of the wheel is internal forces. So, by internal, I mean within Bupa. So, shareholders that own shares in Bupa, and employees who work at Bupa, directors of Bupa. So those are kind of what's within Bupa. External forces are almost a little bit more interesting in a way. Customers, creditors, government agencies, suppliers, and competitors. Let's go through each of them kind of relatively quickly because I'm aware that we're running out of time. So, internal forces. Shareholders. If you were a shareholder of Bupa, to be honest, I'm not sure that Bupa is publicly listed. Are they publicly listed? Let's go and have a look. Anyway, it doesn't matter for now. If you're a shareholder of any company, you would be very concerned with the health of the company. If the company that you have shares in is not doing well, it means that your shareholding is correspondingly going to be lower than what you want. Alara, if asked about an interesting news article, do we always link it back to the law firm and explain why it's interesting in that sense, or would you ever mention how it personally interests you as well? That's a great question, and yes to both of them. So you don't necessarily always have to say it if it's not relevant. So if the partner is asking about your opinion on a certain piece of news, then it's always good to add in a personal touch because he's asking your personal view. So it would be interesting to say, well, I found this fascinating because I've actually been following the private equity sector for a while now, and this piece of news is really interesting to me because I've been following it, and the trend has always been this, but this particular event has actually bucked the trend, or something like that. Or I was actually doing private equity work experience, which is interesting because I was actually working for a client that was a major competitor of this company in this news article, something like that, to kind of show that you're not just Googling or just FTing it for the sake of it. Linking it back to the firm is always good, but if it's too tenuous, then I'd rather you not do it. But also bear in mind that it's not necessarily always about the firm itself as a business. It could also be about the firm's clients as well, which is almost a bit easier because the firm has so many clients. It's almost impossible that the news would not impact them somehow, unless it's not commercial news. Right, going back to Bupa. I believe that Bupa is it's not publicly listed. So that's probably quite a bad example for shareholders in that case. But let's imagine a public company like Tesco's, for example. If you were a shareholder in Tesco's and Tesco's was doing really badly, you'd be really concerned, because if you held, £1,000 worth of shareholding in Tesco's because you have 1,000 shares, and well, actually that wouldn't be right. Let's say 10,000 shares and each was worth 10p. That's why you kind of have £10,000 worth of shares in Tesco's. Then if the share per price per share drops as a result of Tesco announcing some bad news, your shares are now worth, I don't know, 8p for each share. Your shareholding is going to just decrease from £1,000 to £800. So that's obviously not good news for you. The important thing to remember about shareholders is that normally, and this is a huge generalization, but normally shareholders of private companies and shareholders of public companies tend to have pretty different concerns. So shareholders of private companies are much happier normally with long-term decisions. So if the directors choose to make a decision that is going to probably harm the company in the short term, so harm profits in the short term, for example, investing in a massive piece of technology. So obviously for the first few years it's going to cost you a lot of money, but then in the long run it's going to give you a lot of cost savings. If the company is a private company and the shares are owned by, let's say, just one company or two companies, which kind of see the long-term vision and are happy to see their shareholding kind of drop in value, but then go back up in value in the long term, their vision is a little bit kind of, they look a bit further. Whereas if you're talking about something like Tesco's, for example, everything's super volatile. It could be your grandma owning those shares, and if she sees that the share prices have plummeted even for a day, she's going to sell those shares. So it's much more, so with public companies, it's most of the time much more about pandering to the interests and to the opinions of the shareholders who mostly want short-term profit. Right, that's shareholders. Employees. If you were Bupa's employee, like going back to the Bupa article, if you were an employee of Bupa, and let's say this was something that's massive, so if this was Deutsche Bank, let's say, Deutsche Bank being fined a massive amount of money, which it has been before, previously, if you're an employee, what would you think? Would you think, gosh, my employer is really useless. I don't think it's going to be a very successful bank in the future. What's the point of me being here? First of all, I want to have career progression, and maybe another employer is going to give me better career progression, because honestly, I don't even think whether Deutsche Bank, I don't even know whether Deutsche Bank is going to be here in 10 years' time. And secondly, if this is a particularly scandalous piece of news, so for example, Deutsche Bank just announced that they've lost all of their profits and now they're struggling to pay off creditors. Well, that's a massive issue. If I keep working for this bank, are they even going to pay me? Am I going to see my salary? So as an employee, if you're a lawyer who's advising a high-profile employee, for example, you might have something to say. You might say, well, better to move to some other company. Directors, if you're the lawyers for the board of directors, you may have something entirely different to say. So this would mostly be about damage control, reputational damage, financial damage, data breaches. So, for example, going back to the Bupa thing, you might be advising the directors to damage control the PR side of things. You might be asking them to make sure that the data breach, ascertain which clients and which customers have been affected by the data breach, and just try to contain the damage as much as possible, that kind of thing. Making sure that everything's legally compliant and that the directors aren't sort of stepping out of line. So that's the internal stuff. The customers then, let's talk about the yellow stuff, so the external forces. Actually, before we do, there's a question. Becca asks, would they ever ask you about a topic you would know nothing about? If so, what would you do in that situation? That's a great question. I was actually hit with that myself in a training contract interview. They tend to not really do that, because that would be super unfair, because there is an infinite number of topics you could potentially know about, and there's only a finite amount you can really know about. So if they're being fair, if they're playing fair, they normally don't tend to do that. But if you were to be asked that, normally it's because you've somehow mentioned it in your application, or you've somehow mentioned it in your interview, and then they kind of try to drill deeper, which is always why I advise against sounding too clever, because if you talk about something that you don't really know a lot about, and if it was so, you had such bad luck that the partner happens to be an expert in that area, well, you're screwed, because he's going to get super excited and he's going to ask you questions. But if so, what would you do in that situation? I think no law firm is going to expect, and no partner, no interviewer is going to expect you to know everything. So it's more really just about trying to come up with a response with what you know, so, or with what you can reasonably guess. And unfortunately, that's something that really comes with business acumen. So a lot of the stuff in the business world kind of is common sense in a way. And so if you can kind of guess your way through it and make your logic extremely clear, say to the partner why you're saying this, rather than just saying, oh, I think it's this. Hopefully the partner's going to appreciate that thought process. And if the partner gives you more information, and maybe he says, oh, you're correct, or oh, you're wrong, this is actually what it is. So, I appreciate that you've been guessing that, and I appreciate your thought process, but you're wrong. Take that on board and try to make something intellectual and intelligent out of what he says, so that you're proving that you're able to internalize new information and make something useful out of it. But I don't think there's necessarily anything wrong with you making stuff up, as long as you're clear that you are making stuff up and you're just trying your best here. You don't actually know anything, but you're trying to make sense of something that you actually have no knowledge about. I think that's absolutely fine. So let's go to external forces. Customers. If you were the customer of Bupa, and actually if you were the lawyer that was advising a customer of Bupa, you would be extremely concerned with making sure that your client hasn't accidentally allowed his or her data to be compromised. Right? You would be frantically reading up on the Data Protection Act 1998, in this case rather than the GDPR, because that's what the article says, and you would be trying to see what your protections are, and you'd be hopefully trying to maybe sue Bupa if you were affected, or try to somehow find out from Bupa whether your client has been affected. Creditors. Creditors probably not so relevant in this situation, but if we're talking, again, Deutsche Bank. Deutsche Bank has been fined a lot and in big quantities. If you were a creditor of Deutsche Bank, and for those of you who are not clear on what a creditor means, it means Deutsche Bank owes you money, you might get a bit concerned, because you might think, that is a big sum of money. Is Deutsche Bank going to be able to pay me back the money that they owe me? Now, Deutsche Bank is a really big organisation and they probably will have enough cash reserves. But if you're talking about a small company that's accidentally done something wrong and suddenly have been fined without expecting it, or without having a pot of money or a fund that they can dig their hands into, then they are going to have cash flow issues. And as a creditor, you might get very alarmed and you might want to accelerate your loan or something like that. Government agencies. If you were advising a government agency, you would again be having very different priorities. You would be wanting to punish Bupa for deterrence effects. You would want to make sure that Bupa's competitors and other similar companies they're deterred from kind of committing the same crime or the same problem. Suppliers. Similar to creditors, so you could be supplying Bupa with anything. You could be supplying them with anything from insurance to toilet paper. If you're supplying them with something, Bupa probably owes you money because you're giving them, let's say, toilet paper, and they're going to have to pay you back for those goods or services. If the piece of news is going to make you wonder about whether they're going to have cash flow problems as a result, as a supplier, you may want to pull out of your supply contract. You may want to pull out of contractual obligations with them, or you may want to make sure that your payment obligations are secure, for example, by securing your payment installments through, let's say, a parent company guarantee or some sort of security in some other form. Competitors. Competitors are always an interesting one. If you are a lawyer that's advising Bupa's competitor, rather than sitting in your office and laughing and going, haha, like Bupa's screwed up and it's all fun and games for us because we are their competitors and they're going down. As a competitor, you probably start to be a little bit concerned because what does that say about the industry? The industry is vulnerable to data breaches, and the government agencies are probably going to be keeping a very close eye on you. Bupa's hit, but you might be hit next. Ooh. Ooh, sorry. Yeah, so rather than kind of laughing and saying, oh, that's none of my business, you probably, on the contrary, want to be focusing more on how we can prevent what happened to Bupa happening to your clients. You might need to also be concerned with competition, so whether this piece of news means that whether Bupa is going down, or whether those you can maybe poach some of their clients, so maybe you can take advantage of the vulnerabilities that some of Bupa's customers are thinking about. So their customers might want to actually leave Bupa because they're like, oh, I don't know what they're going to be doing with our data. As a competitor, you might think now is a good time for you to then up your marketing game and maybe poach those customers from a more data sort of standpoint. Oh, thank you. You guys are blessing me. Woo. Nupur, hey Tilly, how to understand basic terms of economics? I mean, any good book or website? If I will be honest with you, I don't actually know anything about economics. I know a few things about sort of the jargony stuff in commerce, but I don't think there's really any need for you to understand economics. As a result, I cannot honestly recommend any book or website, but I think that everything you really need to know for a training contract application would be Chris Stokes' book, or books, as some of you have suggested that his other books, apart from Know Your City, is also quite good. Is there anything similar to the FT or The Economist that is free and doesn't require a subscription? Unfortunately, not really, unless you're talking about something that's like a very sector-specific thing. So there are lots of like sector-specific gazettes or newspapers, but nothing that's as generalist but also nuanced as the FT and The Economist. That being said, if you're looking for a specific article, first of all, let me know, because I have an FT subscription and I can look it up for you and print out that article for you. But if you're still going to university, it's likely that your university is going to have an FT subscription, so you can sign up there. Also with The Economist, I think it's like there's like a student offer, so it's like £12 for a year, something like that, which is great. Okay, cool. So that's basically the framework. I hope you guys found that helpful. The idea of this framework is that you can basically apply it to any article you come across, and hopefully that's going to elevate your understanding of that particular piece or that particular article from just the very basic what to the so what, now what, and then being able to analyze that same article from the perspective of different people and different actors. Caitlin, sorry to go back on it, but for the question where you don't know the specific answer to, could you approach it along the lines of, I'm sorry, I don't have enough of an understanding around X area, but I can talk in more detail about Y. I think that's a good approach. I think maybe an even better approach is to say, well, look, I don't know a lot directly about X, but I know a bit about Y, so I'm going to try to give you my spin on what I think the impact of Y is on X. So that you're kind of still answering the question because you're still talking about X, but you're also using your own knowledge to kind of say, I think this is how this affects what you're really trying to ask. Alrighty, that's all I got for you. Thank you very much, guys, for sticking with me all through the 2 hours. I know that my voice can get a bit sleep-inducing. But yeah, chat to you all on Saturday, hopefully, if we're not both ill again. And yeah, any questions, let me know. Bye.